Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you can be with us. Today, you're going to meet one of animal welfare's acclaimed national advocates. From the time she was a young child, Akisha Townsend-Eaton knew she wanted to be a voice for animals, and her career path has been nothing short of remarkable. The legislation she helped enact has benefited not only the lives of animals, but also those who care for them. Today is an opportunity to get to know Akisha a little better and to ask her questions about issues that are important to you. But first, we met with Akisha a few weeks ago. And if you listen closely, you'll hear her new pet rabbit, Tiger, trying to get a word in edgewise. Even though she is off screen, she wanted to chime in with her opinions. After the video, we'll come back for a live chat with Akisha.
My name is Akisha Townsend-Eaton. Before coming to the Animal Legal Defense Fund, I was an animal protection attorney for more than a decade, working primarily in the realm of legislative advocacy. I've had the chance to work full-time as a consultant for major organizations such as the Humane Society of the United States and Best Friends Animal Society, as well as a number of other organizations on a wide variety of issues. I came here to the field for the animals. I grew up, as many people do, with an affinity to animals, grew up with companion animals, and was really concerned about the ways that society considered them, treated them through various systems since college, even before that. I came with a plan to work in this field full time. I had been inspired by many mentors who had come before me. My passion for animals is thanks in large part to my mother. She grew up in the segregated South, where she was legally discriminated against from the day she was born. And she was born at home because she wasn't allowed to be born in a white hospital. So by the time I was born, things had changed a lot, but it had still been less than 20 years before our local community here had been fully integrated. I was often the only Black student in a classroom, or one of two or three, so I faced my own struggles. My mother, who overcame her barriers to become an English teacher and a distinguished educator in the state of Kentucky, always told me to use my experiences and my power to relate to and speak up for the excluded and the marginalized. And she also instilled in me that one of the first tests of humanity was how we considered and treated those with no voice, over whom we had power, were the animals. So she actually had me watch and discuss films about highlighting or films around the experiences and plights of animals, ranging from Dumbo and Where the Red Fern Grows to Bless the Beast and the Children and Animal Farm. And from these discussions, I learned that animals could experience joy, they could experience grief, fear, pain, and then sometimes they were their own change agents as well. By the time I was in college at Stanford, I became concerned with the way animals were treated in various systems. I knew that I wanted a career working in these issues through the legal system. However, full-time jobs at that time in the legal system, working for animals specifically, were few and far between. Fortunately, in my senior year in college, I found a mentor by the name of Andrew Lindsay at Oxford University, and he really helped to give me some inspiration and motivation to seek a path in the field of animal law, even as it was still being developed. And a couple of years later, I found myself at Georgetown Law, where I would eventually get a scholarship from the Animal Legal Defense Fund, as well as mentorship to pursue my dream in the field of animal law. While I was still in law school, I served as an animal welfare fellow in the United States Senate, was able to clerk for the PSPCA, and ultimately, right after law school, I was fortunate to land a full-time career in my dream field at the Humane Society of the United States, drafting a number of local, state, and federal laws protecting animals. As an African American animal protection advocate living in 2021, I always find myself straddling multiple worlds. For instance, on some days, almost immediately before or after ending my day at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, I'm on a call with an environmental justice group centered on the needs of Black Americans, or working with my local NAACP on a range of issues pertaining to discrimination in our community. There is a value in getting to know the groups that are working on these issues in your community and seeing what points of intersection and collaboration are possible to not only create a better world for companion animals, but for the community that is connected to them. So there's a win-win situation there. If there's any one important lesson that I've learned over the years is that our issues have far more overlap than meets the eye. There's so much overlap that I wouldn't even consider our movements to be separate in many respects. When you say, when you ask how can organizations in animal welfare support other social justice movements? I think that for my field in particular, animal law, we often forget and overlook that animal law was in fact inspired by and grew out of the civil rights movement. Our field and so many other nonprofit causes have relied on the precedents gained and the strategies used and the rights won in that movement to advance our own missions. Yet, some of the best outcomes happen when our victories advance the interest of animals that we're focused on, as well as the communities, especially the marginalized communities who are so closely connected to them.
We're here to serve both shelters and animal control because we know if both of those organizations aren't working together and happy with the results, our programs won't be successful.
In the everyday work that we're doing, we're using the tools that my parents and my grandparents and great-grandparents and beyond fought for to uplift their communities. And we're doing that through the lens of animal law, even if we don't always realize that that's what we're doing. I was recently invited to speak to an animal law class. And quite honestly, I was expecting this animal law class to look like what it did when I was in law school over a decade ago, with virtually no racial diversity. So when I spoke to this class, I was pleasantly surprised to find that things had dramatically changed since then. And I think that the diversity in that class reflects where we are as a society today. On this very day, today, there's supposed to be new census data that will be released, and it is expected that that data will show that in 18 states already, less than 50% of the population is white. Think about what that means for our movement. It means the majority of people who are in our communities that are most likely to have relationships with animals are either already people of color or soon will be people of color. It also means that our policymakers, our stakeholders and influencers will increasingly be people of color if they're not already primarily people of color. I think the big question for our movement is, are we willing to embrace this reality to remain sustainable? Or are we going to miss the boat and be left behind? And I think that will only continue to be relevant in the movement if we are adaptable and work to embrace the needs, the desires, and the leadership and direction of the whole of society. And I think that, every organization by now, they understand that they couldn't do the work that they do without their supporters. But in our movement, and I know that in other movements, one of the best kept secrets is that our work as advocates is so much easier because of the invisible work of people who aren't necessarily defined as traditional supporters and stakeholders. I've seen some of our major legislative and policy victories be driven by key staffers and leaders who are in the BIPOC community who aren't necessarily a part of our movement. They'll never be recognized as such, even in my own state of Kentucky, but they are actively working often behind the scenes to make positive change. And they're ordinary people who make these contributions on a day-to-day basis. So think of what can happen when an attorney is able to successfully fight an unlawful eviction of someone who happens to be in a marginalized group, and they are being discriminated based upon their ownership of a companion animal. So not only is that animal prevented from possibly being taken to a shelter, but for the homeowner and for the person who is coming to us for legal assistance, they have a better chance at housing security, and everything that flows from not being displaced, including greater economic stability. Especially in the wake of George Floyd, we've also talked about the importance of Black mental health. And there are a few things that are more distressing than having one of your companion animals be subject to harm or death, especially if you consider that animal to be one of your family members. So this is true for families and individuals of color. It's as true for them as it is for anyone else. And yet I feel for these individual families who would have a lot of difficulty navigating and finding the appropriate legal assistance for their own well-being and survival. An easy way to measure DEI is by getting more people at the table, but we know that alone is not enough to lead to meaningful results. Getting people at the table might be a first good step, but I think other important questions to ask are, how often are folks asked to contribute, lead, and shape the direction of an organization? And how are those contributions directly reflected in the goals, objectives, and indicators that we put forth as an organization, initiative, or effort? In other words, what value do we place on DE&I, not just in terms of getting a variety of faces at our organization and around our tables, but in actually advancing our values and our mission as an organization? In my opinion, a successful DEI effort will often advance an organization's mission, but it might mean shifting directions in the process. It might mean having difficult conversations and being willing to admit that there are blind spots along the way. And in my experience, animal protection organizations have now embraced the need to talk about DE&I, but we all still have a long way to go before we fully realize what the potential is. A journey of 1,000 miles in this case, I think always begins with a conversation. And I am very, very grateful to Maddie's Fund for inviting me to have this one.
Hi, Akisha. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful, wonderful start to our journey. What a great conversation. Thank you, Allison. Just brilliant, brilliant. So, Akisha, let's start with something really easy that I think people may not be aware of, but can you tell us a little bit about the Animal Legal Defense Fund, what they do?
Sure, and thank you so much for the opportunity to welcome me and Tiger in the background to this conversation. So yes, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, I am a managing attorney in their program. And since this is a candid conversation, I will give a disclaimer at first. Any opinions that I express are personal to me and not necessarily reflective of the organization or clients, but we are the only organization in animal protection that is here to advance the interest of animals through the legal system. So that is what kind of makes us unique from some of the other organizations. We are primarily attorneys, but other professionals as well, working in the courts, the legislatures, the administrative side, and also in my program, we provide legal assistance to ordinary folks who find themselves needing assistance with an animal issue that they might not otherwise be able to find in their communities or afford. So that's in a nutshell what we're doing. And I really appreciate the forum here for that, because I know that it's an unconventional, I'm a little bit of an unconventional speaker, but I appreciate it.
Well, I think what you bring to the table, Akisha, is that you remind us that animal welfare and animal protection need to have a much stronger symbiotic relationship, because we can't do one without the other. And so thank you so much for being here. So I know you've worked on a variety of legislation. Is there one piece, if you possibly could, that stands out as something that not only are you most proud of, but you think it has far-reaching implications for the work that we do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I've had a chance to work on a variety of legislative efforts, passing bills at the local, state, federal level. I started out with primarily working on puppy mill laws at the state level, sometimes the local level. So that was probably anywhere from 60 to 80% of my workload, starting off at the Humane Society of the United States. And, one of the things that I learned there, the very first instance where I said, hey, here's a point of intersection, was a case, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, called Tracy versus Selesky. And that was a Maryland decision that basically put strict liability on the owners of dogs who may or may not be dangerous. And we had to work through the courts that time, worked on a brief to provide, hopefully get a positive change. We didn't get that change at that point, the change that we wanted, but it was the first time that I took an opportunity to provide resource materials to renters, because we knew that this decision was causing landlords to, panic and evict people just for having a dog, and specifically a pit bull type dog was deemed inherently dangerous by this decision. So it's my first time getting to reach out to renters and say, this is a really horrible decision, but you still have rights. Here are some resources to help mitigate this. We had some people move states who had the resources to afford to do that. But, in that area, in the Maryland, DC area, and in other places of the country, renters are disproportionately people of color. So that's definitely a point of intersection in terms of any single piece. So, one of the things that I appreciate being able to do in my position is bring my background to the work that I do. I couldn't leave it at the door when I come to work. It would not make me the advocate that I am for animals or people. So to answer your question, there's not a piece of legislation, there's not an initiative that doesn't have a point of intersection with the broader community. So other examples, we were just talking before the conversation about Hurricane Katrina. So that happened before I entered the field of law, a few years before, but we only got the PETS Act, which is a federal piece of legislation that enables communities to create evacuation plans for people and pets together. With that was the result of, unfortunately, people refusing to evacuate without their pets and losing their lives as a result. Many of those were brown and Black people that were facing poverty, which connected to a whole other slew of issues. So we knew poverty is an issue, but why? Was there a situation where people felt trapped to begin with? We've got a legacy of discrimination through redlining, environmental justice issues that played into that. But, I wasn't instrumental at all in that piece of legislation, but, that's something that we're still working on implementing in communities. So there's an opportunity to provide education. I mentioned actually in the video is mentioned that I am a member and a leader in our local NAACP, and I'm proud to say that because of that effort, we're able to put collaboration with animal sheltering in the environmental justice toolkit that we have. So there is an intersection there. Community cats, dangerous dogs, all of those have multiple levels of intersection, and it really is dependent on the community that you're looking at and the area that you're working in. There is one state that I was working in that had a very well-intentioned law, and this is why it's important to really look at each community situation before copying and pasting text from another jurisdiction's area. But in this particular state, there was a fine for not capturing or vaccinating any cat that happened to walk across your property. So the intention there was, to promote trap, neuter, return. It was well intentioned, but in reality, you had some communities where the ability to trap or neuter a cat was non-existent because somebody couldn't necessarily afford the equipment, or they were an hour away from the vet, but they still faced, up to I think it was in excess of $100 of a fine for each incident that was a violation. So those are barriers that I help to remove, systemic barriers to allow these programs to exist. And of course, dangerous dogs, that's a whole other issue. In my community, I'm very proud actually of some of the changes that we've made in my community most recently, and a lot of communities are looking at their animal codes. But our animal control division is housed under neighborhood and community services, which ideally, is going to create solutions before you need to activate law enforcement or the legal system to solve a problem. And we recently took a look at our code and everything that fell under animal cruelty and neglect and welfare, and said, wait a minute, we are penalizing somebody if their dog barks once. That is not a cruelty issue. That is not a neglect issue. There's a fine associated with that, possible impoundment, and then barriers to getting that dog back. So we're going to look at that nuisance law and strike that provision. Right. And I just thought, go
Akisha,
ahead.
let me just, because I think it's really important that you're talking about your community as a great example. Eunice has asked a question. How do we discover what are local and state laws that might protect animals from being neglected, abused, and abandoned? And then how do we try to improve them? I mean, so it's like, where do you go if you're not an attorney and you're trying to figure out what those laws are?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing I would do is, find out who is who's your local government. What are the who are your representatives? In many communities, those ordinances will be directly on the government's webpage. So you can just ask your city or your county clerk, what are the ordinances specifically? I'd like to know what the animal ordinances are, and they will be able to direct you to that. There are other big websites like MuniCode and American Legal Publishers that have that. If you type in your city, sometimes you have to go down and get a copy of it physically, which can be interesting in rural communities. But that's a very good question. And in terms of improving the law, so my organization specifically, we have a lot of anti-cruelty resources, and we work with different professionals to improve that angle of it. From the life-saving angle, I think Maddie's fun. I don't know if you offer any types of resources. There's Best Friends. There are other organizations that focus on that. But as I was saying before, it is also really important to know your community. I think that it's really challenging to just copy and paste text without knowing what the implications are going to be. For example, you might get a model law, right? And I think model laws are really, really helpful in terms of providing overall objectives in terms of, this is what's going to be the best outcome for the animal. But I just was listening to a discussion recently for a county that was revising its animal code. And there was a reclaim provision, which was associated with the fine. And, the fine had to be paid at City Hall in order to reclaim the animal at the shelter. But how is that person going to know, Yeah. And is the fine, and one of the council members was like, well, are we going to be able to actually collect this fine? So you want to make sure that, what is the intention of it? In my community, the wealth of communities of color and similar communities is as little as 1/3 of the wealth of white people or white residents. So we have the median income and the ability to pay those fines are going to be different. So if you are, if you have a zip code that you're looking at, if, the demographics of your community make it so that the outcome for the animal is that they're not really returned, they're subject to not having a live outcome at the shelter, that might be something to examine, one of the many factors. So what not only is, how do we improve laws, but what kind of laws do we have on the books now? How have they been applied historically? And then, of course, getting community stakeholders of all kinds is also something that I would advise. As it happens, in my community, the president of our NAACP is also on the nuisance board. And they handle animal issues. But he's one of those invisible stakeholders that you wouldn't necessarily think to tap.
So Akisha, this has just been a remarkable start to our journey together. And I thank you so much for being here today. And there's so many other questions that I'm sure everybody has about just the life that you've led, the great impact that your mother and your great grandmother have had on you. The fact that your cousins are taking care of colonies of cats. I love that. That has just been such a great part of your story. So for those of you who'd like to continue the conversation, I encourage you all to go to the forum. Akisha will be available to answer questions, to offer any other suggestions that people may have. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. This has just been another great conversation. And Akisha, you have now given us a whole new reason why we should have more rabbits in our lives, because that was not an adding machine as the background to Akisha's video. That was her pet rabbit. So just love that. Allison, thank you so much to all of you. I hope you have a great day. And again, go to the forum to hear more from Akisha, to ask your questions. Thank you all.
Thank you.